My daughter-in-law threw her drink in my face in front of everyone, and I remember the cold splash, the sting, the humiliation, while my own son looked away, pretending not to see it happen, and she leaned in close and whispered that I was nothing, that I should know my place in their house, as if I were some burden they were forced to carry. And in that moment the room fell silent, but inside me something far older and stronger awakened. I did not shout, I did not defend myself. I simply wiped my face and walked away while she laughed behind me, certain she had won, certain she understood exactly who I was and what I was worth. She had no idea that the truth was already in motion, that her cruelty had set off a chain of events she could never have predicted, and that the next morning, when the legal team arrived asking only for me by name, the first crack in her confidence appeared. What she did not know was that everything she believed about power, money, and control in this family was about to be turned upside down, and that the man she dismissed as useless was holding a truth that would rewrite every assumption she ever made about her future. Stay with me, because this story does not end with humiliation. It ends with revelation, justice, and consequences so sharp, even she could not fake a smile through them. And when the truth finally surfaced, the look on her face was the moment everything changed. My name is Frederick Callahan. I am 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges, highways, and office towers across Colorado. My wife Margaret passed away 5 years ago, leaving me with a quiet house, a lifetime of memories, and a son I thought I knew. The invitation came by text, which should have been my first warning. Andrew never called anymore. His messages arrived, clipped and functional, like memos from a distant colleague rather than words from a son to his father. Dinner Sunday. 6 p.m. Vanessa's cooking. No greeting, no warmth, just coordinates to a meal I was apparently expected to attend. I pressed my best shirt, picked up a bottle of wine Margaret would have chosen, and drove across town telling myself that family was worth the effort. I had been telling myself that lie for 12 years. Vanessa opened the door with the kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She was 40 years old, immaculately dressed, and possessed the particular talent of making every greeting feel like a dismissal. "Frederick," she said, not stepping aside immediately. "You're early." I was exactly on time, but I had learned long ago that correcting Vanessa only prolonged the interaction. I handed her the wine. She glanced at the label, said nothing, and finally allowed me entry into my own son's home. The living room was arranged like a stage set. Gloria Hartwell, Vanessa's mother, sat in the corner armchair with a glass of white wine, watching everything with the quiet attention of a theater critic. She was 62, silver-haired, and carried herself with an elegance that felt rehearsed. When our eyes met, she smiled, a small, knowing expression that made the hair on my neck stand up. I nodded politely and moved toward the kitchen, where I could hear Lily's laughter. My granddaughter was the only honest thing in that house. 11 years old, bright-eyed, and utterly incapable of pretense. She ran to me the moment I appeared, wrapping her arms around my waist. "Grandpa, I made the salad myself." I held her tight, breathing in the simple joy of her presence. Whatever else this evening would bring, Lily made it worthwhile. Dinner began civilly enough. Andrew sat at the head of the table, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. He avoided my eyes, focusing instead on his plate, his wine glass, anywhere but directly at me. Vanessa controlled the conversation with practiced efficiency, discussing renovation plans, vacation destinations, the endless social calendar that seemed to consume her life. Gloria contributed occasional observations, each one landing like a small test I didn't understand. The shift came during the main course. Vanessa set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I had seen before, the prelude to something unpleasant. "You know, Frederick, I've been thinking about your situation." I waited, saying nothing. It must be difficult, living alone in that big house, rattling around with nothing to do, no purpose. She paused, letting the words settle. "Honestly, it's becoming a burden on all of us, worrying about you." I set down my own fork carefully. "I appreciate your concern, Vanessa. But I manage quite well. I pay my own bills, maintain my own home, and I certainly don't recall asking anyone to worry." Her eyes narrowed. "There's no need to be defensive. I'm just saying what everyone is thinking." I glanced at Andrew. He stared at his plate. Gloria sipped her wine, watching. "Perhaps," I said quietly, "we could discuss this another time. and perhaps with a bit more respect. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Vanessa picked up her cocktail glass and threw the contents directly into my face. The cold hit first ice and vodka and cranberry splashing across my eyes, my cheeks dripping down my collar. Lily screamed. Andrew froze. Gloria's expression didn't change at all, as if she had been expecting this moment, perhaps even waiting for it. I reached for my napkin slowly, wiping my face with hands that refused to tremble. The room held its breath. Vanessa sat perfectly still, chin raised, daring me to react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. "I think I'll head home early," I said, rising from my chair. My voice came out steady, almost gentle. I kissed Lily on the forehead. She was crying now, clutching my sleeve, and walked to the door without looking back. Behind me, I heard Gloria whisper something to Vanessa. I heard my daughter-in-law laugh softly in response. In my car, I sat for a long moment, letting the engine idle. My phone buzzed with a message from Maggie Doyle, Margaret's oldest friend. I opened it with wet fingers. "I found what you asked about. We need to talk about Gloria Hartwell. Call me tonight." I pulled out of the driveway and into the darkness, feeling something shift deep in my chest. Not anger, something colder, more deliberate. For 5 years, I had swallowed insults for the sake of peace. For 12 years, I had watched my son disappear into a marriage that hollowed him out piece by piece. I had been patient because Margaret asked me to be, because I believed family deserved endless chances. But patience, I realized, had become permission, and permission had become contempt. The time for silence was over. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, just as I had left it. Margaret's roses still lined the walkway, though I tended them with less skill than she ever had. 5 years of coming home to silence, and still I sometimes expected to see her silhouette in the kitchen window, waiting up with tea and questions about my day. Tonight, the emptiness felt sharper than usual. Tonight, I needed her wisdom more than ever, and all I had were the echoes of a life we built together. I changed out of my vodka-stained shirt and stood for a long moment in our bedroom, looking at her photograph on the nightstand. Margaret at 55, laughing at something I had said during our anniversary trip to Santa Fe. She had been gone 5 years, taken by a cancer that moved faster than any doctor predicted. In those final months, she had been unusually focused on paperwork, legal documents, meetings with our attorney that she insisted on attending alone. I thought it was her way of maintaining control when everything else was slipping away. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. The safe sat in the back of our closet, hidden behind winter coats I never wore anymore. I hadn't opened it since the week after her funeral, when I retrieved her jewelry to give to Lily someday. But there had been other documents inside, a thick envelope with Margaret's handwriting on the front. I remembered the words she had written, words that seemed melodramatic at the time, the product of illness and medication. Open only when our son forgets who raised him. I had dismissed it as excessive caution. Margaret had always been the planner, the one who saw problems before they materialized. Surely Andrew would never forget. Surely our family would hold together. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed the combination. The envelope was exactly where I had left it, yellowed slightly at the edges. Margaret's precise handwriting still sharp and clear. I carried it to the kitchen table, poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey, and began to read. The first document was a revised will, dated 18 months before her death. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the meaning became clear as I worked through each paragraph. Margaret and I had founded Callahan Engineering together 40 years ago, building it from a 2-person operation into a firm worth several $1,000,000. What I had forgotten, or perhaps never fully understood, was how we had structured the ownership. Margaret held 51%. I held 49%. We had agreed on this arrangement decades ago, because she handled the business side while I focused on the technical work. It never mattered while she was alive. We made every decision together. But Margaret had not left her shares to Andrew directly. Instead, she had placed them in something called a conditional trust, administered by our attorney Elias Monroe. The conditions were specific and unambiguous. Andrew would inherit his mother's shares only if he demonstrated ongoing respect and care for his father. If he failed this standard, if he abandoned me, mistreated me, or allowed others to do so, the shares would revert entirely to me during my lifetime, then pass to Lily upon my death. Andrew, I realized with a cold shock, owned nothing. He had been CEO of Callahan Engineering for 8 years, drawing a substantial salary, making decisions that affected dozens of employees. But he held not a single share of the company his parents had built. His authority existed entirely at my discretion, a discretion I had never thought to exercise because I never knew I had it. I read the trust document 3 times before I fully absorbed its implications. Then I called Maggie. She answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting. "I saw the text you sent earlier," I said. "What did you find about Gloria Hartwell?" Maggie's voice was careful, measured. She had been Margaret's closest friend for 30 years, a former paralegal with a sharp mind and a deep distrust of anyone who smiled too easily. "I've been digging for 3 weeks now, Fred. Ever since you mentioned something felt wrong at Thanksgiving, Gloria has a history. She told me about a man named Walter Henderson, a 75-year-old widower who had lived in Fort Collins 8 years ago. Gloria had befriended him through a church group, gained his trust over several months, then convinced him to sign documents he didn't fully understand. By the time his children realized what was happening, Gloria had transferred his house into her name and drained most of his savings. The family tried to prosecute, but Gloria had covered her tracks well enough to avoid criminal charges. The civil case was going nowhere," Maggie continued, "until someone came forward with evidence of similar patterns. Bank records, forged signatures, testimony from another victim who had been too embarrassed to speak up. That someone was Margaret. I closed my eyes. Margaret reported her, more than reported. She testified. She provided documentation. She made sure Gloria lost her real estate license, her reputation, everything she had built. Gloria's husband left her. Her business collapsed. She had to start over completely. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Gloria's daughter marrying my son, just 3 years after Margaret destroyed Gloria's life. The slow campaign to isolate Andrew from his family, the escalating cruelty toward me, always just deniable enough to seem like mere rudeness rather than strategy. I looked down at Margaret's will, at the careful provisions she had made, at the conditions she had imposed. She hadn't been paranoid. She had been preparing for a war she knew was coming, a war she wouldn't live to fight herself. I stared at her handwriting, her final gift hidden in legal ink. "You knew," I whispered to the empty room. "You saw this coming before anyone else." I called Elias Monroe at 7 the next morning. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been expecting this call for 5 years. Perhaps he had. Margaret had chosen him as our attorney precisely because he combined legal brilliance with an almost supernatural patience. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the quiet confidence of a man who had seen every form of human deception and learned not to be surprised by any of it. When I explained what had happened at dinner, what I had discovered in Margaret's documents, he listened without interruption. When I finished, he said simply, "I'll assemble my team. We move today." By noon, I was sitting in Elias's office reviewing the trust documents in detail. His 2 associates, a young woman named Patricia and a serious man named David, had already pulled the corporate records for Callahan Engineering. The picture they painted confirmed what Margaret's will had outlined. Andrew's position as CEO came with a generous salary, a company car, and the illusion of authority. But the actual ownership remained split between the trust Margaret had established and the shares I held directly. Together, I controlled 100% of the company my son believed he was running. "He never asked," Elias said, noting my expression. "In 8 years, Andrew never once requested documentation of his ownership stake. He simply assumed." He paused, or perhaps someone convinced him not to look too closely. We arrived at Andrew's house at 3 in the afternoon. Elias had suggested calling ahead, but I wanted to see their faces when they realized the game had changed. His black sedan pulled into the driveway behind my truck, and the 3 attorneys emerged in their dark suits like a judicial delegation. I stayed in my vehicle for a moment, watching through the windshield as Vanessa appeared at the front window, her expression shifting from curiosity to irritation. She opened the door before Elias could knock. "Frederick, I didn't expect to see you so soon after your dramatic exit last night." Her eyes moved to the attorneys behind me. "And you've brought friends. How lovely." Elias stepped forward, extending a business card. "Mrs. Callahan, my name is Elias Monroe. I'm the legal counsel for Callahan Engineering and the administrator of Margaret Callahan's estate. I need to speak with your husband regarding urgent matters concerning the company. Vanessa didn't take the card. Whatever this is, it can wait. Andrew is working from home today, and we have plans this evening. I'm afraid it cannot wait, Mrs. Callahan. Elias's voice remained perfectly pleasant, but something in his tone made Vanessa's smile falter. I'm here on behalf of the majority shareholder. This meeting will happen today, either here or at my office. The choice is yours. The phrase hung in the air between them, majority shareholder. I watched Vanessa's face as she tried to process the words, searching for meaning that didn't fit her understanding of the world. In her mind, Andrew ran the company. Andrew would inherit everything when I died. Andrew was the future, and I was merely an obstacle to be managed until nature took its course. The possibility that this narrative might be wrong had clearly never occurred to her. Andrew appeared behind his wife, drawn by voices he didn't recognize. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting a sleepless night. When he saw me, something flickered across his face, guilt, perhaps, or the hope that I had come to make peace. "Dad, what's going on? May we come inside?" Elias asked. This conversation requires privacy. The living room felt smaller with 6 people in it, the elegant furniture suddenly inadequate for the tension that filled every corner. Andrew and Vanessa sat on the sofa while I took the armchair across from them. Elias remained standing, his associates positioned near the doorway like sentinels. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. "Mr. Callahan," he began, addressing Andrew, "I'm here to inform you of certain provisions in your mother's estate that directly affect the ownership structure of Callahan Engineering." He laid out the trust documents, the corporate bylaws, the chain of ownership that Margaret had so carefully constructed. Andrew's face grew paler with each page. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then stepped into the hallway to answer. I heard her whisper, urgent and confused, "Mom, they're saying something about shares, something about majority ownership. Just handle it, okay? Find out what this means." When she returned, her composure had cracked slightly. Gloria's reassurance, whatever it had been, was clearly not enough. Elias continued methodically, explaining that Andrew held the title of CEO but owned no equity in the company, that his authority derived entirely from the board's approval, a board that consisted of myself and 2 seats currently vacant, that Margaret's shares would transfer to him only upon meeting conditions that, based on recent events, had not been satisfied. "This is absurd," Vanessa interrupted. "Andrew has run that company for 8 years. You can't just walk in here and claim he owns nothing." "I'm not claiming anything, Mrs. Callahan. I'm reading legal documents prepared by your mother-in-law and filed with the state of Colorado." Elias's voice never rose. "Furthermore, I'm formally requesting all financial records for Callahan Engineering from the past 3 years. A comprehensive audit will begin within the week." The color drained from Vanessa's face. Andrew sat frozen, unable to speak, unable to meet my eyes. Elias gathered his documents and closed his briefcase. As he turned toward the door, he glanced at Vanessa and said softly, "Mrs. Callahan, I suggest you consult your own attorney. You're going to need one." The silence that followed Elias's departure stretched for nearly a minute. Andrew sat motionless on the sofa, staring at the documents spread across the coffee table as if they might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Vanessa paced near the window, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking in hushed tones that I could not quite hear. I remained in the armchair, watching my son try to absorb the truth that his entire professional identity had been built on a foundation he never owned. "I don't understand," Andrew finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running that company for 8 years. I make decisions every day. I sign contracts, approve budgets, hire and fire employees." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the boy he had been, confused and searching for answers I was supposed to provide. "How is it possible that I own nothing?" "Because you never asked." The words came out gentler than I intended. "In 8 years, you never once requested documentation of your ownership stake. You assumed, Andrew, you assumed your mother and I had transferred everything to you, and you never verified. Why would I need to verify? You're my parents. I trusted you. Trust goes both ways, son." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Your mother and I built that company from nothing. 40 years of work, of sacrifice, of reinvesting every profit back into growth. We always intended for you to inherit it, but we also believed you needed to earn it. We wanted to see the man you would become before handing over everything we had created." Vanessa ended her call and turned to face me, her composure partially restored. "This is ridiculous. You can't just waltz in here and claim Andrew has no rights to his own family's business. We'll contest this. We'll take it to court." "You're welcome to try," I said, "but I should warn you that Margaret's trust was drafted by one of the best estate attorneys in Colorado, reviewed by 2 independent firms, and filed with every relevant authority. It has stood unchallenged for 5 years. The conditions are clear, the language is precise, and the intent is unambiguous." I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Andrew was supposed to demonstrate that he could be trusted with the company, that he would treat his family with respect and care, that he would be the kind of man his mother believed he could become. "And you're saying he failed?" Vanessa's voice dripped with contempt. "Based on what? One dinner where things got a little heated? Based on 12 years of watching my son disappear?" I stood, suddenly unable to remain seated. "Based on holidays where I was treated like an unwelcome guest in my own family, based on phone calls that were never returned, birthdays that were forgotten, and 1,000 small cruelties that I excused because I wanted to believe the best." I turned to Andrew. "Based on watching you sit in silence while your wife threw a drink in my face and insulted me in front of your daughter." Andrew flinched as if I had struck him. "Dad, I wanted to say something. I just didn't know how to." "You didn't know how to defend your own father?" The anger I had suppressed for so long threatened to break through, but I forced it down. This was not about rage. This was about truth. "That's exactly the problem, Andrew. You've spent so long avoiding conflict that you've forgotten what's worth fighting for." The front door opened without warning, and Gloria Hartwell swept into the room as if she had been summoned by some invisible signal. She wore a cream-colored blazer and an expression of maternal concern so perfectly calibrated that it might have been rehearsed in front of a mirror. "I came as soon as Vanessa called," she said, moving to embrace her daughter. "What's all this nonsense about ownership and audits?" "Mrs. Hartwell." I kept my voice flat. "I don't recall anyone inviting you to this conversation." Gloria released Vanessa and turned to face me, her smile warm and utterly false. "Frederick, please. Surely we can discuss this like family. There's no need for lawyers and threats. Whatever misunderstanding has occurred, I'm certain we can resolve it together, without all this unpleasantness." I studied her face, searching for the woman Maggie had described. The predator who had stripped an old man of his home and dignity. The schemer who had spent years positioning her daughter to do the same to me. She returned my gaze with practiced innocence, not a flicker of guilt disturbing her pleasant expression. "Family," I repeated. "That's an interesting word coming from you, Mrs. Hartwell. Family doesn't throw drinks in an old man's face. Family doesn't whisper in corners while their daughter humiliates a grieving widower. Family doesn't smile and nod while watching someone be systematically erased from their own son's life." I took a step closer, close enough to see her pupils contract. "I know what you are. I know what you did to Walter Henderson, and I know exactly why your daughter married my son." For the first time, something shifted behind Gloria's eyes. The warmth vanished, replaced by something harder and far more honest. She held my gaze without blinking, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. "You think you've won something here, Mr. Callahan, but I've been playing this game longer than you've been retired." 3 days passed after Gloria's threat, 3 days of silence from Andrew's house. No calls, no texts, not even an automated response to the messages I left. Elias assured me this was normal, that people in Vanessa's position often retreated to regroup and strategize. But the quiet unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. I found myself checking my phone constantly, not for word from my son, but for any sign that Lily was okay. She was the innocent in all of this, an 11-year-old girl caught between adults who should have known better than to wage their wars in front of her. The call came at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. I was already in bed, reading one of Margaret's old novels because her handwriting in the margins made me feel less alone. My phone lit up with a video request from an unknown number, and I nearly declined it until I saw the tiny preview image. Lily's face, pale and tear-streaked, illuminated by the blue glow of a screen held too close. I answered immediately. "Lily? Sweetheart, what's wrong?" She was crying, the kind of silent tears children learn to shed when they're afraid of being heard. Her voice came through in a whisper, broken and trembling. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something. I heard Mom and Grandma Gloria talking tonight. They didn't know I was listening." My chest tightened. "It's okay, honey. Take your time. I'm listening." She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her pajamas, glancing nervously at something off-screen. Her bedroom door, I realized. She was terrified of being caught. They were in the kitchen after I went to bed. I came down to get water, but I stopped on the stairs when I heard them say your name. "What did they say?" Lily's lower lip quivered. "Grandma Gloria said you were just a stupid old man who didn't know when to give up. She said once they control Dad, they control the money, and then they won't need to pretend anymore." The words tumbled out faster now, as if she was afraid she might lose her courage. "And Mom said something about making sure you never see me again. She called me leverage, Grandpa. I don't even know what that means." But the way she said it made me feel sick. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe slowly. The rage that surged through me was unlike anything I had felt in years, a cold and terrible fury that demanded action. But Lily needed comfort, not vengeance. She needed to know that her world had not completely fallen apart. "Lily, listen to me very carefully." I kept my voice as steady as I could manage. "What you heard was not your fault. None of this is your fault. Sometimes adults say terrible things, things they shouldn't say, especially when they think no one is listening. But they meant it, Grandpa. I could tell. They weren't just mad. They were planning something." "I know, sweetheart. I believe you." She seemed to relax slightly at those words, the validation she desperately needed. I asked gentle questions, careful not to make her feel like a witness being cross-examined. How often did her mother and grandmother have these conversations? Did they always happen at night? Had she ever heard them mention specific plans? Lily answered as best she could. Vanessa and Gloria met privately at least twice a week, sometimes at the house and sometimes at a coffee shop downtown. They always sent Lily to her room or scheduled their talks during her soccer practice. She didn't understand most of what they discussed, but she knew it involved money, lawyers, and her grandfather. "They keep talking about documents," she said, "and something called power of attorney. Mom wants Dad to sign something, but he keeps putting it off." The mention of power of attorney sent a chill down my spine. I had seen that particular weapon used before, had watched helpless families lose everything because a single signature transferred control to the wrong hands. If Vanessa was pushing Andrew to sign over legal authority, the situation was more urgent than I had realized. "Lily, I need you to know something." I leaned closer to the screen, wishing I could reach through and hold her. "No matter what happens between the adults in this family, you are my granddaughter. That will never change. I will always protect you, always fight for you, always be here when you need me. Do you understand?" She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm scared, Grandpa. I don't want them to take you away from me." "They won't. I promise you, sweetheart. They won't." For a moment, something like hope flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. Instead, her expression shifted to pure terror, her gaze snapping to something behind the phone. The bedroom door burst open with a violence that made me flinch even through the screen. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her face twisted with a rage I had never seen before. The composed, calculating woman I knew had vanished, replaced by something feral and desperate. "What did you tell him?" she screamed, lunging toward Lily. "What did you tell him?" I shouted my granddaughter's name, but the screen was already spinning, capturing a blur of motion and shadow. I heard Lily cry out once, a sound of fear that would haunt me for weeks. Then the call went dead, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but silence and the cold certainty that everything was about to get worse. I spent the next 2 days trying to reach Lily. Every call to Andrew's house went unanswered. My texts disappeared into silence. I drove past their home twice, but my son's car was gone both times, and the windows stared back at me like closed eyes. Elias advised patience, warned me that showing up unannounced might give Vanessa ammunition for a harassment claim. So I waited, pacing the floors of my empty house, replaying the sound of my granddaughter's cry until it echoed in my dreams. On the third day, Gloria Hartwell appeared on my doorstep. She arrived in the late afternoon, dressed in soft pastels that suggested warmth and reconciliation. In her hands, she carried a bottle of wine, the label expensive enough to imply respect. Her smile was gentle, almost maternal, as if the woman who had threatened me just days ago had been replaced by someone's kindly grandmother. "Frederick," she said, her voice pitched low and soothing. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought perhaps we could talk, just the two of us. Clear the air a bit." Every instinct screamed at me to close the door in her face, but Margaret had taught me long ago that you learn more from your enemies when they believe they're winning. I stepped aside and let her enter, watching her eyes sweep across the foyer with barely concealed appraisal. "What a lovely home," she murmured, following me toward the living room. Margaret had wonderful taste. I imagine a place like this must be worth quite a bit these days, with the market the way it is. I gestured toward the sofa but remained standing myself. "I haven't checked the value recently. It's not for sale." "Of course not." I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. She settled into the cushions as if she owned them, crossing her ankles with practiced elegance. "I just know how difficult it can be, maintaining a large house alone. The property taxes, the upkeep, all those little repairs that add up over time. Have you considered something smaller? A nice apartment, perhaps, or one of those assisted living communities? I'm 68, Mrs. Hartwell, not 90. I manage perfectly well. I'm sure you do." Her smile never wavered. "I'm simply thinking of your comfort, your well-being." She paused, tilting her head as if a thought had just occurred to her. "Do you have a will, Frederick? I know it's morbid to discuss, but at our age, these things matter. You wouldn't want your assets tied up in probate, leaving poor Lily with nothing." There it was. The real purpose of this visit, wrapped in concern and delivered with the precision of a scalpel. I thought of Maggie's description of Gloria's technique with Walter Henderson. First came the friendship, the sympathetic ear, the casual questions about finances and family. Then came the isolation, the subtle suggestions that children and friends couldn't be trusted. Finally, when the target was alone and vulnerable, came the documents. "Sign here, initial there. Don't worry about the details. I'll take care of everything. My affairs are in order," I said carefully. "My attorney handles all of that." "Elias Monroe?" Gloria's eyes flickered with something that might have been annoyance. "Yes, I've heard he's quite thorough, very protective of his clients." She reached for the wine bottle she had brought, holding it toward me like an offering. "Shall we open this? I think a drink might help us both relax. I don't drink with people who threaten my family." The mask slipped for just a moment. Gloria's pleasant expression hardened, and I glimpsed the calculation beneath. Then the warmth returned, smoother than before. "I never threatened anyone, Frederick. I simply stated a fact. I've been navigating difficult situations for a very long time. I know how these things unfold." She rose from the sofa, smoothing her skirt, and walked slowly toward the door. Her gaze lingered on Margaret's photographs, on the antique cabinet we had purchased in Santa Fe, on the small details that revealed the shape of a life. I could almost see her cataloging each item, estimating its value, planning its dispersal. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to face me. "You remind me of someone I knew years ago. A man named Henderson, Walter Henderson. Stubborn man, proud to a fault. He thought he could outlast me too." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it now, only the cold satisfaction of someone remembering a victory. "He died alone, Frederick. His children had abandoned him, his friends had all drifted away, and he spent his last years in a facility that smelled of disinfectant and regret. I visited him once, near the end. He didn't even recognize my face. My blood turned to ice." She wasn't just referencing Henderson. She was confessing, daring me to acknowledge what we both knew, and in that confession was a promise. She had done this before, and she would do it again. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. Gloria's smile widened. "Of course. I've said what I came to say." She stepped through the door, then glanced back one final time. "Give my love to Lily. Such a sweet girl. I do hope she learns to keep her mouth shut." I watched her car disappear down the road, my hands trembling with a fury I could barely contain. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Elias. "I need everything you can find on Gloria Hartwell," I said when he answered. "Legal records, civil suits, criminal history, financial disclosures, all of it. I don't care what it costs." Elias called back within 48 hours, but the news he brought had nothing to do with Gloria's past. "We found something during the audit," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man delivering bad news. Someone attempted to transfer $200,000 from Callahan Engineering's operating accounts to an offshore holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The holding company traces back to a shell corporation with Gloria Hartwell listed as the sole beneficiary. I sat down heavily in Margaret's reading chair, the phone pressed tight against my ear. When did this happen? 3 weeks ago. The transfer was initiated using Andrew's credentials, but the authorization pattern didn't match his normal behavior. Our security system flagged it automatically and froze the transaction pending review. Elias paused. Fred, those security protocols were installed at Margaret's request. 7 years ago, she told me at the time that she wanted protection against internal threats. I assumed she meant employee theft. Now I'm not so sure. Margaret had seen this coming. Even then, even before the cancer diagnosis, she had been building defenses against an enemy she never named. I wondered how much she had known, how much she had merely suspected, and why she had never shared her fears with me. Perhaps she hoped she was wrong. Perhaps she wanted to protect me from a truth that would have destroyed my relationship with Andrew years earlier. There's more, Elias continued. I pulled the documentation for the transfer authorization. It was signed using a power of attorney that Vanessa filed 6 months ago. According to the paperwork Andrew submitted to the bank, he granted his wife full control over all his financial assets, including his access to company accounts. Andrew would never agree to that. He did agree to it. His signature is on the documents, notarized and witnessed. But when I spoke with the notary, she mentioned that Andrew seemed distracted during the signing, barely glanced at the papers before putting pen to them. Vanessa told her they were updating life insurance policies for their daughter. The betrayal crystallized into something sharp and cold. Vanessa had not just stolen from the company. She had manipulated my son into handing over the keys to everything he had, using their daughter as the excuse. Andrew, trusting and distracted and desperate to avoid conflict, had signed away his autonomy without even reading the words above his name. I drove to Andrew's office that afternoon, not calling ahead, not giving him time to prepare excuses. He was alone when I arrived, sitting behind a desk covered with spreadsheets and coffee cups, looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. When he saw my face, whatever greeting he had prepared died on his lips. "Did you know what she was doing?" I asked, closing the door behind me. Andrew's expression crumbled. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't feign confusion or demand explanations. He simply sat there, shoulders slumping, as if he had been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "I suspected," he said quietly. "About 6 months ago, I noticed some discrepancies in our joint accounts. Money moving in patterns I didn't recognize, transfers to accounts I'd never seen before. I asked Vanessa about it, and she said it was investments, tax planning, nothing I needed to worry about." "And you believed her?" I wanted to believe her. His voice cracked. "Dad, you don't understand. Every time I questioned anything, she made me feel like I was being paranoid, controlling, unreasonable. She said I didn't trust her, that I was turning into you." He looked up at me, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd lose her, lose Lily, lose everything I'd built. "So you chose to look away." "I chose my family." The words came out defensive, almost pleading. "I chose to keep the peace, to give her the benefit of the doubt, to believe that the woman I married couldn't possibly be capable of what I was starting to suspect." I stared at my son, searching for the boy I had raised, the young man who had once asked me to teach him how to build things that would last. What I found instead was a stranger, someone hollowed out by years of accommodation and compromise, someone who had traded his integrity for the illusion of harmony. "You didn't choose your family, Andrew. You chose your comfort. You chose the path that required the least courage, the least confrontation, the least honesty." I turned toward the door, unable to look at him any longer. "Vanessa's greed I can fight. Your cowardice breaks my heart." I left him sitting alone in his office, surrounded by the remnants of a company he thought he controlled and a life he had never truly examined. The drive home felt longer than usual, the weight of disappointment pressing down on my chest like a physical burden. Elias called that evening, his tone grimmer than before. The full audit results came in. That $200,000 was just the beginning. "Vanessa's been siphoning money for 3 years, Fred. Small amounts at first, then larger as she grew more confident. We're looking at systematic fraud totaling nearly $500,000. The meeting convened 3 days later in my living room, the same room where Margaret and I had celebrated anniversaries, where Lily had taken her first steps, where our family had once gathered for holidays filled with laughter instead of accusations. Now it felt like a courtroom, chairs arranged in a rough circle, faces grim and guarded. Elias sat beside me with a leather folder thick with documentation. Maggie occupied the armchair near the window, her presence a silent reminder that I was not alone in this fight. Andrew and Vanessa arrived together but sat apart, a careful distance between them that spoke louder than words. Gloria had attempted to join them. I watched through the window as she emerged from Vanessa's car, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression arranged into something approaching concern. But when she reached my front door, Elias was already there, blocking her entry with the polite immovability of a man who had spent 30 years navigating hostile negotiations. "I'm afraid this meeting is limited to immediate family and legal counsel, Mrs. Hartwell." "I am family," Gloria protested. "My daughter needs my support." "Your daughter needs an attorney, which I strongly suggest you help her retain, given what we're about to discuss." He closed the door before she could respond, leaving her standing on my porch with an expression I would have paid money to photograph. Inside, the silence stretched until it became unbearable. Vanessa sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, her composure cracking around the edges. Andrew stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I waited, letting the tension build, because I had learned that people reveal themselves most clearly when they cannot stand the quiet any longer. Elias opened his folder and began laying documents on the coffee table, one by one, like cards in a game whose stakes had become unbearably high. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts Vanessa controlled, forged authorization forms bearing Andrew's signature but initiated from devices he had never used, fabricated expense reports for consulting services that were never rendered, travel reimbursements for trips that never occurred. The evidence accumulated in neat stacks, each page another nail in a coffin Vanessa had built for herself. "The total comes to $417,000 over 3 years, Elias said, his voice carefully neutral. The funds were systematically diverted through a series of shell accounts, ultimately tracing back to holdings controlled by Gloria Hartwell. The pattern is consistent with long-term financial fraud, executed with considerable sophistication." Vanessa's mask finally shattered. "I did it for our family," she cried, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Do you have any idea what it's like, living under the thumb of a man who controls everything? Fred was going to cut us off anyway. He was going to leave us with nothing. I was protecting Andrew, protecting Lily, protecting our future." The accusation hung in the air, waiting for me to respond with the anger she clearly expected. Instead, I spoke quietly, almost gently, because the truth required no volume. "I never threatened anyone, Vanessa. I never mentioned cutting anyone off. I never used money as a weapon, or leverage, or punishment." I looked at her directly, holding her gaze until she was forced to look away. All I ever did was stop giving blindly. I started asking questions. I wanted to understand where my support was going and whether it was being used wisely. That's not control, that's responsibility. The room fell silent. Vanessa's breathing came in shallow gasps, her carefully constructed narrative collapsing around her. Andrew continued to stare at the floor, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped between his knees like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew. Then he stood up. His movement was so sudden that everyone turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, and when he spoke, his voice shook with the effort of forcing words past whatever barrier had kept them locked inside for so long. I knew. The confession dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Maggie's expression hardened. Elias set down his pen. Vanessa's head snapped toward her husband, a flash of something like betrayal crossing her features before she could suppress it. "I've known for 6 months," Andrew continued, the words tumbling out now as if a dam had broken. "I found the transfers. I saw the discrepancies. I confronted Vanessa, and she told me it was necessary. She said you were trying to control us, Dad. She said you were manipulating the company, using your ownership to keep us dependent, that you would never let go until you had destroyed everything we built together." He swallowed hard, tears beginning to streak down his cheeks. "She said she was protecting Lily's future. She said if I really loved my daughter, I would trust her and stop asking questions. I listened without interrupting because there was nothing to say. The betrayal I had suspected was now confirmed, laid bare in my own living room by the son I had raised and loved, and apparently failed in ways I was only beginning to understand. "And you believed her," I finally said. "You believed her over me." Andrew broke. The controlled facade he had maintained throughout the meeting crumbled completely, and he wept like the child he had once been, the boy who used to run to me when the world became too frightening. "I was afraid, Dad. I was afraid of losing her, losing Lily, losing everything. I thought if I just kept quiet, if I just let her handle things, eventually it would all work out. I thought I could fix it later, when things calmed down." 6 months, Andrew. For 6 months, you watched your wife steal from the company your mother and I built. You watched her lie to me, manipulate me, turn my own granddaughter into a pawn. And you said nothing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to believe anymore. I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years in the effort it took to rise from that chair. Andrew looked up at me with desperate hope, as if somehow I might still offer the absolution he craved, might still find a way to make this right. I walked past him toward the door. "Dad, please." His voice cracked on the words. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have come to you. I should have trusted you. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." I paused at the threshold but did not turn around. The anger I had expected to feel was absent, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. Grief, perhaps, or the peculiar numbness that comes when someone you love reveals themselves to be someone you never really knew. "You made your choice, son," I said quietly. 6 months ago, you chose her. Now live with it. The days following the confrontation passed in a haze of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. I moved through my house like a ghost, eating meals I didn't taste, reading pages I didn't remember. Andrew called 17 times. I let each call go to voicemail, listening later to messages that progressed from desperate apologies to angry accusations to hollow silence. Vanessa, predictably, retained an attorney and ceased all direct communication. Lily remained unreachable, a hostage in a war she never asked to be part of. Maggie arrived on the 4th morning, carrying a cardboard box heavy enough to require both hands. She set it on my kitchen table without ceremony, her expression carrying the grim satisfaction of someone who has finally completed an unpleasant but necessary task. "I've spent the last 3 weeks pulling every thread I could find on Gloria Hartwell," she said, removing the lid. Inside were folders, documents, photographs, printouts of newspaper articles, and court records. What I found goes deeper than either of us imagined. She began laying out the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades organizing information. Gloria Hartwell had been a licensed real estate agent in northern Colorado for 15 years. Her specialty was working with elderly clients, particularly widowers looking to downsize after losing their spouses. She built a reputation for patience and compassion, for hand-holding nervous seniors through complicated transactions, for being the kind of professional who remembered birthdays and sent flowers during difficult times. It was all a mask. She targeted at least 4 elderly men that I've been able to document, Maggie continued. The pattern was identical each time. She would befriend them through church groups or community organizations, gain their trust over months of careful cultivation, then gradually insert herself into their financial affairs. By the time the families realized what was happening, she had drained accounts, transferred properties, and disappeared behind a wall of forged documents and shell companies. Walter Henderson had been her most ambitious target, a 75-year-old widower with no children and a paid-off home worth nearly $500,000. Gloria had worked on him for 2 years, eventually convincing him to sign a power of attorney that gave her complete control over his assets. By the time a distant nephew grew suspicious, Henderson's house was in Gloria's name, his savings had vanished into untraceable accounts, and the old man himself was showing signs of dementia that made him an unreliable witness. The family tried to prosecute, Maggie said, but Gloria had covered her tracks well. The case was going nowhere until someone came forward with evidence linking Gloria to similar schemes in other counties. Bank records, forged signatures, testimony from another victim who had been too ashamed to speak publicly. She paused, meeting my eyes. That someone was Margaret. The name hit me like a physical blow. I sat down heavily, gripping the edge of the table. Margaret stumbled onto Gloria's pattern while helping a friend purchase a retirement property. Maggie continued. She recognized inconsistencies in the paperwork, did some digging, and realized she was looking at systematic fraud. She went to the authorities with everything she had found. Her testimony was the key that unlocked the entire investigation. I thought of my wife in those final years, the quiet intensity with which she approached her work, the hours she spent on projects she never fully explained. I had attributed it to her nature, her perfectionism, her need to see things through. I never imagined she had been waging a secret war against someone who would one day try to destroy us. Gloria lost everything because of Margaret, Maggie said. Her license, her reputation, her income. Her husband divorced her. She was left with nothing but a daughter and a burning need for revenge. The final piece clicked into place with sickening clarity. Vanessa meeting Andrew, I said slowly. It wasn't an accident. No. Maggie shook her head. Gloria spent years planning this. She raised Vanessa with one purpose: find the son of the woman who destroyed their lives and take everything they have. Every dinner party, every family gathering, every moment Vanessa spent building trust with Andrew and contempt for you, it was all choreographed. Your daughter-in-law's entire marriage has been a long con, Fred. 12 years of performance, waiting for the right moment to strike. I stared at the documents spread across my table, feeling the architecture of my life rearrange itself around this new understanding. Margaret's conditional will, her insistence on security protocols, her careful choice of Elias as our attorney, none of it had been paranoia. She had known Gloria would come eventually. She had spent her final years building defenses she hoped we would never need, preparing weapons she prayed would never be used. She knew, I whispered. She knew, and she never told me. She was protecting you. Maggie reached into the box and withdrew a final item. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, my name written across the front in Margaret's familiar handwriting. She gave this to me 6 months before she died, made me promise to keep it safe until the right time. She placed it in my hands gently, as if it were something fragile and precious. She said, "Only open it when everything falls apart." I think we're there, Fred. Maggie left shortly after handing me the envelope, understanding without being told that some moments require solitude. I heard her car pull away, heard the house settle back into its familiar silence, heard the ticking of the grandfather clock Margaret had inherited from her parents. For a long time, I simply sat at the kitchen table, holding the envelope in both hands, studying my wife's handwriting, as if the loops and curves of her letters might somehow bring her back to me. The paper had yellowed at the edges, 5 years of waiting having left their mark. My name was written in Margaret's careful script, the same handwriting I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the notes she used to leave on my pillow when she woke before me. I ran my thumb across the ink, half expecting it to still be wet, half hoping this was all a dream from which I would soon wake to find her beside me. I opened the envelope slowly, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Inside were 2 items. The first was a handwritten letter, several pages long, folded neatly into thirds. The second was a smaller envelope, sealed with a strip of tape that had begun to yellow. Across its front, Margaret had written, "For Lily Open on her 18th birthday." I set Lily's envelope aside and unfolded my wife's final message. "My dearest Fred," the letter began, and I could hear her voice in every word, that gentle cadence she used when she had something important to say and wanted to make sure I was truly listening. "If you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I'm so sorry I couldn't be there to face them with you." She wrote of discovering Gloria's connection to Vanessa 3 months before Andrew's wedding. A chance encounter at a charity event had brought Gloria back into Margaret's orbit, and something in the woman's smile, a flash of recognition, a glint of triumph had set off alarms that refused to quiet. Margaret had investigated carefully, pulling threads she had thought long buried, and what she found terrified her. "Gloria never forgave me for what I did to her," Margaret wrote. "I understood that. I even accepted it. What I didn't anticipate was her patience, her willingness to sacrifice her own daughter's happiness on the altar of revenge. By the time I realized Vanessa had been groomed for this purpose, it was too late. Andrew was in love, or thought he was, and nothing I said could reach him. She had tried to warn him." I read that passage 3 times, feeling each word like a knife sliding between my ribs. 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret had sat Andrew down and shared everything she had discovered about Gloria's past, about the Henderson case, about the patterns she saw repeating in Vanessa's behavior. Andrew had listened politely, then dismissed her concerns as paranoia, as jealousy, as an overprotective mother's inability to let go. "He told me I was interfering," Margaret wrote. "He said I was trying to control his life, that I couldn't stand to see him happy with someone I hadn't chosen. He asked me not to attend the wedding if I couldn't support his decision. So I smiled, and I attended, and I watched my son marry a woman I knew would eventually destroy him." Unable to prevent the marriage, Margaret had done the only thing left within her power. She had rebuilt her will, creating the conditional trust that would protect me if Andrew failed the test of character she desperately hoped he would pass. She had installed security protocols in the company accounts, quiet safeguards that would flag suspicious activity. She had chosen Elias as our attorney specifically because of his reputation for thoroughness and his immunity to charm. She had given Maggie the envelope I now held, with instructions to wait until the moment it was needed most. "I wanted to tell you everything," she wrote, and I could see the pain in her handwriting, the way certain letters trembled slightly as if written through tears. "But I knew that telling you would force you to choose between your son and your suspicions. I couldn't do that to you, Fred. I couldn't make you carry that burden while I was still alive to share it. So I chose to carry it alone, and to prepare for the day when you might have to carry it without me." The letter continued for another page, filled with practical advice about the legal framework she had built, about the importance of documentation, about the allies she had cultivated over years of careful planning. But it was the final paragraph that broke me. "My dearest Fred, if you're reading this, then I was right to worry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you while I was alive, but I've left you the tools to protect yourself. Trust Elias, he knows more than he's told you, and he's waiting for you to ask the right questions. Trust Maggie, she loved me like a sister, and she will love you the same way. And whatever happens, don't let them take Lily. She's innocent in all of this. A child caught between forces she doesn't understand. Promise me you'll fight for her, Fred. Promise me you won't let Gloria win." I set the letter down because I could no longer see the words through my tears. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, I wept not from sadness, though sadness was part of it, but from something larger and more complex. Gratitude, perhaps. Wonder at the depth of her love, at the lengths she had gone to protect a future she would never see. She had fought for me across the barrier of death itself, had reached through 5 years of silence to place weapons in my hands at the exact moment I needed them most. When my vision cleared, I noticed there was more. At the bottom of the final page, Margaret had added a postscript in smaller handwriting, as if it were an afterthought, though I knew my wife well enough to understand that nothing she did was ever truly unplanned. P.S. I know what Gloria did to Mr. Henderson, and I know she'll try the same thing with you. The difference is you're not alone. I spent 3 days reading Margaret's letter, returning to it each morning as if the words might change, might reveal something new I had missed. They never did, but the act of reading brought me closer to her, made me feel less alone in the battle that lay ahead. On the 4th day, I began to pack. The cabin by the lake had been Maggie's suggestion, made months ago when tension with Vanessa first began to escalate. It was a modest property in the mountains west of Denver, 2 hours from Andrew's house, and a world away from the life I had built with Margaret. I had resisted the idea at first, viewing it as retreat, as surrender. Now I understood it differently. This was not flight. This was repositioning, moving to higher ground, where I could observe and document and respond without being caught in Vanessa's daily crosshairs. Margaret had taught me that sometimes the strongest move was the one that looked like weakness. I packed methodically, selecting only what mattered. Photographs of Margaret, of Lily, of the life we had shared before everything went wrong. Legal documents Ilias had prepared, the letter and the sealed envelope for my granddaughter. Everything else could stay. The house would keep, maintained by a service Maggie had arranged, waiting for a future I could not yet imagine. Andrew arrived on the second afternoon of packing, his car pulling into the driveway with the hesitance of someone approaching a place they were no longer sure they were welcome. I watched him through the window for a long moment before opening the door. He looked worse than the last time I had seen him, thinner, paler, with the haunted expression of a man whose certainties had crumbled beneath him. "Dad," his voice cracked on the single syllable. "Please, can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him enter. though I did not offer the coffee or the comfortable chair that hospitality would normally require. He stood in the foyer, surrounded by boxes, taking in the evidence of my departure with something like panic. "You're leaving," he said. "Where are you going? You can't just disappear. What about the company? What about Lily?" "The company is in Elias's hands until further notice, and Lily knows where to find me." I continued wrapping a picture frame, giving my hands something to do. "What did you want to talk about, Andrew?" He moved toward me, stopping just out of arm's reach, as if uncertain whether proximity might help or harm his case. "I've seen everything now. Elias showed me the full audit, the offshore accounts, the connections to Gloria. I didn't know, Dad. I swear I didn't know how deep it went. You knew enough." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood, from moments when he was overwhelmed and searching for words. "I should have come to you 6 months ago. I should have trusted you instead of her. I was weak and I was stupid, and I let her convince me that you were the enemy." His voice broke. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. Just tell me what to do to make this right." I set down the picture frame and faced my son directly. The anger I had felt during our last confrontation had faded, replaced by something more complicated: grief for the relationship we had lost, pity for the man he had allowed himself to become, and beneath it all, a stubborn ember of love that refused to die completely. "You want to know what to do? Start by understanding what you did." I kept my voice level, denying him the emotional reaction he was seeking. "You had 6 months to tell me the truth. 6 months of watching your wife steal from the company your mother and I built. 6 months of letting her isolate me, manipulate me, turn my own granddaughter against me. And you chose silence, Andrew. That's not betrayal by accident. That's betrayal by choice. I was trying to protect my family. You were trying to protect yourself. There's a difference." He flinched as if I had struck him. For a moment, I thought he might argue, might summon some final defense. Instead, he simply stood there, tears sliding down his cheeks, a 42-year-old man reduced to the helplessness of a child who had finally grasped the consequences of his actions. I turned back to my packing. "Go home, Andrew. Take care of your daughter. Figure out what kind of man you want to be. When you're ready to show me instead of telling me, we can talk again." He left without another word. I listened to his car disappear down the road, then continued filling boxes until the sun began to set. Lily came the next morning. She arrived on her bicycle, having apparently ridden the 3 miles from her house without telling anyone. When I opened the door, she threw herself into my arms, sobbing with the abandon that only children and the truly devastated can manage. "Please don't leave me, Grandpa. Please. Everyone is fighting and Mom won't let me call you and Dad just cries all the time. Please don't go away." It was the only moment I wavered. Holding my granddaughter, feeling her tears soak through my shirt, I understood for the first time the full cost of what Margaret had asked me to do. Fighting for Lily meant fighting through her, meant causing pain in the short term for protection in the long term. The calculus was brutal, and there was no path forward that didn't leave scars. "Listen to me." I knelt so that we were eye to eye, brushing the hair from her face. "I will never abandon you. Do you understand? Never. I'm moving somewhere quieter, somewhere safe, but you can visit me every weekend. I'll teach you to fish, just like I taught your father. We'll watch the stars at night and make hot chocolate in the mornings. This isn't goodbye, Lily. This is just a different kind of hello." She clung to me for a long time before her grip finally loosened. I drove her home myself, watching until she disappeared inside before pulling away. The image of her small figure waving from the doorway stayed with me all the way back to my empty house. I was loading the final box into my truck when my phone rang. Elias's name appeared on the screen, and something in my gut tightened before I even answered. "Vanessa just filed an emergency petition with the family court," he said without preamble. "She's claiming you've been emotionally abusing Lily, manipulating her, turning her against her parents, causing psychological harm. She's demanding sole custody and a restraining order that would prevent you from any contact with your granddaughter." I set down the box and stared at my phone. The audacity of it took my breath away. The woman who had used Lily as leverage, who had screamed at her for speaking to me, was now claiming I was the abuser. It was masterful in its cruelty, the kind of move that revealed exactly what Gloria had taught her daughter. Vanessa had played her final card. Now it was my turn. The courtroom smelled of old wood and nervous sweat, the kind of atmosphere that accumulates in places where lives are regularly dismantled and rebuilt. I arrived early, taking a seat at the respondent's table beside Elias, watching the room fill with strangers who would soon pass judgment on my fitness as a grandfather. The walls were lined with portraits of judges past, their painted eyes following the proceedings with the detached interest of those who had seen it all before. Vanessa entered with her attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Deborah Crane who had built a reputation on aggressive family litigation. Behind them came Gloria, dressed in muted colors that suggested humility, taking a seat in the front row of the gallery where she could observe everything without appearing to participate. I watched her settle into position, hands folded, expression neutral, and understood that we were about to witness a performance that had been rehearsed for weeks. The hearing began with Vanessa's expert witness, a child psychologist named Dr. Richard Palmer, who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to lending academic credibility to predetermined conclusions. He testified that he had conducted 3 sessions with Lily over the past 2 weeks, during which he observed clear indicators of emotional manipulation consistent with elder influence. He described patterns of divided loyalty, anxiety about family conflict, and what he termed artificially accelerated attachment to the grandfather figure at the expense of the maternal bond. In your professional opinion, Deborah Crane asked, is continued contact with Mr. Callahan in the child's best interest? Dr. Palmer shook his head gravely. Based on my evaluation, I believe such contact would cause ongoing psychological harm. The child has been conditioned to view her grandfather as a source of security and her parents as threats. This dynamic is consistent with deliberate alienation tactics commonly employed by controlling family members. Elias cross-examined with surgical precision, establishing that Dr. Palmer's firm had received significant payments from a consulting company that traced back to Gloria Hartwell, that his evaluation had been conducted without input from Lily's school counselor or pediatrician, and that his conclusions contradicted the observations of every other professional who had interacted with my granddaughter. But damage, once done, is difficult to undo, and I could see the judge making notes, weighing testimony, treating the hired expert with the same consideration as legitimate evidence. Vanessa took the stand next. She wore a simple dress and minimal makeup, the costume of a woman too stressed by circumstances to care about appearance. When she spoke, her voice trembled with perfectly calibrated emotion. I never wanted it to come to this, she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Frederick is my husband's father. I wanted Lily to have a relationship with her grandfather. But over the past few years, his behavior has become increasingly erratic. He criticizes everything I do. He undermines my authority as a mother. He tells Lily things about me that aren't true, trying to turn her against her own parents. I watched her perform, recognizing the technique Gloria had perfected years ago with other targets, other families. Every gesture was calculated, the slight catch in the throat, the reluctant pauses before particularly damaging claims, the way she looked at the judge with pleading eyes as if begging to be believed. In the gallery, Gloria sat motionless, but I noticed her fingers tapping against her knee in subtle rhythms, signals that corresponded to shifts in Vanessa's testimony. A tap before his emotional escalation, 2 taps before a strategic pause. It was choreography, rehearsed and refined, the same performance the Henderson family must have witnessed before their father lost everything. Elias presented our evidence methodically. Phone records showing I had initiated contact less frequently than Vanessa claimed, financial documents demonstrating the fraud that had precipitated this conflict, witness statements from Maggie detailing Gloria's history of manipulation. The judge reviewed each document carefully, but Vanessa's attorney objected frequently, challenged chain of custody, questioned relevance, transformed what should have been a straightforward presentation into a grinding battle of procedural attrition. By late afternoon, I could feel the momentum shifting against us. Vanessa had painted a compelling portrait of a grieving widow turned vindictive patriarch, a man using his wealth and influence to control a family that no longer wanted him. The truth was buried beneath layers of expert testimony and emotional performance, and I began to understand how Mr. Henderson must have felt in his final days watching reality dissolve into narrative, powerless to stop the theft of everything he loved. Then Elias stood and addressed the bench. Your Honor, we have one additional witness we would like to call. Given the circumstances, we were unable to include her in our initial filing, but her testimony is directly relevant to the matters before the court. The judge frowned. This is highly irregular, Counselor. I understand, Your Honor, but the witness specifically requested to speak. She believes she has information the court needs to hear. Deborah Crane objected immediately, but the judge raised a hand for silence. After a long moment, she nodded. I'll allow it. But this is your last witness, Mr. Monroe. The courtroom door opened. Lily walked in alone, her small frame somehow filling the space with a presence that silenced every whisper. She wore her school clothes, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, face pale but composed. Her eyes found mine for just a moment before she turned to face the judge. Your Honor, Lily said, her voice small but steady. I have something I need to tell the truth about. The courtroom held its breath as Lily approached the witness stand. She looked impossibly small against the dark wood paneling, an 11-year-old girl stepping into a world designed for adults who had forgotten what honesty looked like. Vanessa half rose from her seat, her attorney's hand on her arm, the only thing keeping her in place. In the gallery, Gloria's composed expression flickered for the first time since the hearing began. The judge leaned forward, her voice gentler than it had been all day. Young lady, do you understand where you are and why you're here? Yes, Your Honor. Lily's voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the silent room. I'm here because people have been telling lies about my grandfather, and I want to tell the truth. Go ahead then. In your own words, tell me about your relationship with your grandfather. Lily took a breath, her small hands gripping the edge of the witness box. My grandfather is the kindest person I know. He never hurt me. He never scared me. He taught me how to ride a bike and how to make my grandmother's recipe for apple pie. He comes to my school plays and remembers my friends' names. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had hardened with a resolve that seemed far beyond her years. The person who scares me is my mother. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward through the courtroom. Vanessa made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her attorney scribbled furiously on a legal pad. The judge's eyes narrowed, but she did not interrupt. Can you explain what you mean by that? The judge asked. My mother and my grandmother, Gloria, have been planning things for a long time. Bad things. They talk about my grandfather like he's an enemy, like he's someone who needs to be destroyed. Lily reached into the pocket of her jacket and withdrew a smartphone, not the latest model, but an older device, the kind a child might receive as a hand-me-down. I recorded them. I didn't know if anyone would believe me, so I started keeping evidence. Deborah Crane shot to her feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is completely improper. The witness is a minor. Any recordings she made cannot possibly be admissible. Colorado is a one-party consent state, Your Honor, Elias interrupted calmly. Any party to a conversation may legally record it without the knowledge of other participants. Lily was present during these conversations. Her recordings are admissible. The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. I'll allow it. Play the recordings. Elias connected Lily's phone to the courtroom's audio system. The first recording crackled to life, and Gloria's voice filled the room with a clarity that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. Once we have custody, Fred won't dare fight us. He'll be too afraid of never seeing the girl again. We'll have complete control over Andrew, over the company, over everything Margaret tried to protect. Then Vanessa's voice, colder than I had ever heard it. Good. Let him rot in that cabin alone. He'll die alone, just like Henderson. That's what he deserves for what his wife did to you. The recording continued, fragment after fragment, conversation after conversation. They discussed the fraud in clinical terms, debating how much they could siphon before triggering audits. They strategized about the custody petition, Gloria coaching Vanessa on exactly which phrases would resonate with family court judges. They laughed about my isolation, about Andrew's weakness, about how easy it had been to dismantle a family from the inside. When the final recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge's expression had transformed from careful neutrality to something approaching disgust. She turned to Vanessa, who sat frozen in her chair, all color drained from her face. Mrs. Callahan, the judge said, her voice like ice, do you have any response to what we've just heard? Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her attorney whispered something urgent, but Vanessa wasn't listening. She was staring at Lily with an expression of utter betrayal, as if the child she had used as a pawn had suddenly transformed into something she didn't recognize. The judge didn't wait for an answer. This petition is dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering all evidence presented today to be transferred immediately to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. She looked at Vanessa with unconcealed contempt. Mrs. Callahan, I strongly advise you not to leave the jurisdiction. What happened next unfolded in slow motion. Vanessa stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward, and lunged toward the courtroom's side exit. Two bailiffs moved to intercept her, their hands firm on her arms as she struggled. She twisted toward the gallery, toward Gloria, her voice rising to a scream. You said this would work. You promised me. You said he would lose everything. Gloria remained perfectly still, her face a mask of calculated distance. She did not respond to her daughter's accusations, did not offer comfort or explanation. She was already calculating her own exit. I realized already distancing herself from the wreckage of a plan that had finally collapsed. As the officers led Vanessa toward the door, she turned one last time and locked eyes with me. The rage that had defined her for so long was gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest. Fear, the terror of someone who had finally run out of moves, who understood at last that the game was over and she had lost. I simply nodded, a small gesture that carried the weight of everything I could not say aloud. I told you, I promised Margaret, and I kept that promise. The weeks that followed moved with the slow inevitability of justice finally catching up to those who had outrun it for too long. Vanessa's arrest made the local news, a brief story about financial fraud and family court drama that most viewers probably forgot within hours. But for those of us who had lived through it, every development carried weight that no headline could capture. The charges came quickly: fraud, forgery, perjury, filing false reports with the court. The district attorney, a methodical woman named Patricia Vance, laid out the evidence with the same precision Elias had used in the custody hearing. Faced with Lily's recordings and the paper trail Elias had assembled, Vanessa's attorney advised her to plead guilty. A trial would only make things worse, would drag every sordid detail into public view, and guarantee the maximum sentence. Vanessa, stripped of Gloria's guidance and facing consequences for the first time in her life, accepted the deal. The judge who presided over her sentencing was not the same one who had heard the custody petition, but word travels fast in courthouse circles. He reviewed the case with visible distaste, noting that Vanessa's crimes represented a systematic betrayal of family trust conducted over years with calculated precision. He imposed a suspended sentence of 18 months, conditional on her completion of 200 hours of community service and full restitution of the $417,000 she had stolen. Additionally, he issued a 5-year restraining order prohibiting any contact with me or Lily. Vanessa stood motionless as the terms were read, her face a mask of exhausted resignation. The woman who had once thrown a drink in my face couldn't even meet my eyes. Gloria's reckoning took longer, but cut deeper. The evidence from Lily's recordings gave the district attorney grounds to reopen the Henderson case, which had languished in cold storage for 8 years. Walter Henderson had died 3 years earlier, alone in a memory care facility, just as Gloria had boasted. But his nephew, the same one who had first raised concerns about Gloria's influence, was still alive and eager to testify. Combined with Maggie's documentation and the clear pattern of predatory behavior Gloria had demonstrated with my family, the prosecution built a case that even Gloria's expensive defense attorney couldn't dismantle. I attended her sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom where she couldn't see me. Gloria entered in prison orange, her silver hair now streaked with gray roots she had always been careful to hide. She had aged a dark-cast decade in the months since the custody hearing, the careful facade finally crumbling to reveal the hollow architecture beneath. The judge sentenced her to 3 years in state prison, citing the calculated nature of her crimes, her lack of remorse, and the devastating impact on multiple families. As the bailiffs led her away, she turned and scanned the gallery, searching for something sympathy, perhaps, or a final target for her manipulation. Her eyes passed over me without recognition. I was just another face in a crowd of people she had underestimated. Andrew filed for divorce the same week Gloria's sentence was announced. The proceedings were swift and uncontested. Vanessa, barred from contact with her daughter and facing financial ruin, didn't fight for custody. The court granted Andrew full parental rights, a decision that surprised no one who had followed the case. What did surprise people was Lily's statement to the family court evaluator. "I want to live with my dad," she had said. "He made mistakes, but he's trying to be better, and I want to see my grandpa every weekend. That's the only thing I really care about." The final hearing took place on a Thursday morning in early spring. I sat in the gallery, watching as the judge formalized the custody arrangement and officially dissolved Andrew's marriage to the woman who had nearly destroyed us all. When it was over, I remained in my seat as the courtroom emptied, processing the strange mix of relief and exhaustion that comes when a long battle finally ends. Andrew approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the nearly empty room. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking more like the uncertain boy I remembered than the broken man he had become. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence held everything we had been through: the betrayals, the revelations, the wounds that might never fully heal. "Dad." His voice cracked on the word. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know words don't fix what I let happen. I was a coward. I chose comfort over truth, and I almost lost everything that mattered because of it." He swallowed hard, tears gathering in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life earning back your trust, however long it takes, whatever I have to do." I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in months. I saw the damage Vanessa had done, the years of manipulation that had worn away his confidence and judgment. But I also saw something else, something fragile and new, the beginning of accountability. The first trembling steps toward becoming the man Margaret had always believed he could be. "Words are easy, Andrew." I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 68 years. "Show me who you're going to be." 6 months passed like water finding its level after a storm. The cabin by the lake became my home in ways my old house never quite managed after Margaret died. I woke each morning to the sound of birds and whined through pine trees, ate my meals on a porch overlooking water that reflected the mountains like a mirror, and slowly learned to breathe again without the weight of conflict pressing against my chest. The quiet wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. Andrew came every Sunday without fail. The first few visits were awkward, stilted conversations over coffee that neither of us knew how to navigate. He would arrive at 10 in the morning and leave by noon, both of us exhausted by the effort of being in the same room without the buffer of crisis. He never asked about the company's shares. He never mentioned money or inheritance or any of the things that had once seemed so important. He just showed up, week after week, as if the simple act of presence was the only language he had left. I watched him from a careful distance, guarded against the possibility that this was another performance, another manipulation learned from years of living with Vanessa. But the weeks accumulated into months, and slowly I began to see something I hadn't expected: genuine change. Andrew had started therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in what he called recovery from coercive relationships. He spoke about it openly, without shame, acknowledging that he had spent 12 years being shaped by someone who had never loved him, only used him. The insight didn't excuse his choices, but it explained them in ways that made forgiveness feel less impossible. At work, the transformation was equally visible. Elias kept me informed of developments at Callahan Engineering, and the reports consistently surprised me. Andrew had called an all-hands meeting shortly after the divorce was finalized, standing before the employees his wife had defrauded and apologizing without qualification or excuse. He explained what had happened, took full responsibility for his failure to detect and prevent the theft, and announced that he would be donating 20% of his salary for the next 3 years to an elder abuse prevention charity Margaret had once supported. Several employees who had been considering resignation decided to stay. The company, against all odds, began to stabilize. But it was Lily who showed me most clearly that healing was possible. She arrived at the cabin every Friday evening, her backpack stuffed with homework and books, and the endless energy of an 11-year-old finally free from the tension that had defined her childhood. Her grades improved dramatically, her teachers reporting that she had transformed from a withdrawn, anxious student into someone engaged and curious and quick to laugh. She helped me in the garden, learning to tell weeds from seedlings, getting dirt under her fingernails without complaint. She sat beside me on the dock while I taught her to fish, asking questions about her grandmother, about the life Margaret and I had built before everything went wrong. "Grandpa, she asked one afternoon, her line drifting lazily in the water. "Do you think Grandma would be proud of me?" I looked at my granddaughter, at the strength she had shown in that courtroom, at the courage it took to stand up and tell the truth when everyone around her was lying. "I think she would be incredibly proud," I said. "I think she's watching right now, and I think she's amazed at the person you're becoming." Lily smiled, and for a moment I saw Margaret in the curve of her lips, in the light behind her eyes. The bond between us had deepened into something unbreakable, forged in the fire of everything we had survived together. The conversation I had been avoiding finally happened on a Sunday in late autumn, when the leaves had turned gold and the air carried the first hints of approaching winter. Andrew and I sat on the porch after Lily had gone inside to start her homework, watching the sun sink toward the mountains in silence. I had been carrying the weight of Margaret's secret for months, uncertain whether sharing it would help or harm the fragile reconciliation we had built. "There's something I need to tell you about your mother's will," I said finally. "Something I should have explained months ago." Andrew turned to face me, his expression open and waiting. I told him everything, the conditional trust, the protections Margaret had built, the love that had motivated every clause and provision. I explained how she had tried to warn him before the wedding, how he had dismissed her concerns, how she had spent her final years preparing for a battle she hoped would never come. "She knew," Andrew said quietly when I finished. "She knew what Vanessa was, and I wouldn't listen. She knew what Gloria was. Vanessa was just the weapon." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But your mother never stopped believing you could be better, Andrew. Neither did I. We just needed you to believe it yourself." Andrew sat in silence for a long moment, processing the revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I wasted so many years. I let her manipulate me into becoming someone Mom would have been ashamed of. Someone I'm ashamed of. The man you were isn't the man you're becoming. That's what matters now." He nodded slowly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, yellowed and creased, as if it had been hidden away for years. "Dad, there's something I need to give you. I found it in Vanessa's things after she left, hidden in a box she kept locked in her closet. I don't know how she got it or why she kept it." He handed me the envelope with trembling fingers. "It's addressed to you, from Mom." The envelope trembled in my hands as I turned it over, recognizing Margaret's handwriting immediately. My name was written across the front in her familiar script, the same elegant loops I had seen on thousands of notes and cards throughout our 40 years together. The paper was worn at the edges, suggesting it had been handled many times, read and reread by someone who had no right to its contents. I looked at Andrew, searching for explanation. "I think Vanessa found it years ago," he said quietly. "Maybe she kept it as leverage, or maybe she just wanted to understand the woman who had nearly destroyed her mother's life. I don't know. But it belongs to you, Dad. It always did." I opened the envelope carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, dated 6 years ago, our 39th anniversary, just months before Margaret's diagnosis changed everything. The letter was short, barely filling the page, but each word carried the weight of a lifetime shared. "My dearest Fred," she had written, "I woke this morning thinking about the day we met, how nervous you were, how you spilled coffee on your blueprints trying to impress me. 40 years later, you still make me laugh. You still make me feel safe. You have been my partner in everything that matters, building a business, raising a son, creating a life worth living. I know I don't say it enough, but I am so proud of the man you are. Your strength, your patience, your stubborn refusal to give up on the people you love. You are my anchor, Fred. Whatever storms may come, whatever challenges our family faces, I know we will weather them because of you. Hold steady, my love. Hold steady, and know that I will love you beyond the end of my days." I read the letter 3 times before I could see clearly again. Margaret had written these words before she knew she was sick, before the diagnosis that would steal her from me, before she began the secret work of protecting our family from threats only she could see. This was simply love, pure and unguarded, the kind of truth people rarely commit to paper because it makes them vulnerable. Vanessa had kept it hidden for years, perhaps planning to use it as a weapon, never understanding that love letters cannot wound the people they were written for. They can only heal. A year passed. The cabin by the lake transformed from refuge into home, its rooms filling gradually with the evidence of a life rebuilt. I hung Margaret's photographs on every wall, surrounded myself with memories of the woman who had loved me well enough to fight for me even after death. I planted a garden in the clearing behind the house, growing tomatoes and peppers and the herbs she had always used in her cooking. I bought a small boat and learned to fish properly, spending long mornings on the water with nothing but silence and sunlight for company. But solitude was not the same as isolation. I joined a veterans group in the nearby town, meeting weekly with men and women who understood that some battles leave scars invisible to everyone except those who share them. I volunteered at the community center, teaching basic engineering principles to underprivileged kids who had never held a blueprint or calculated a load-bearing ratio. Their curiosity reminded me why I had fallen in love with the profession in the first place, the joy of building something that would outlast the hands that created it. Andrew continued his Sunday visits, the awkwardness of our early reconciliation gradually giving way to something resembling the relationship we had lost. We talked about the company, about Lily, about Margaret, and the lessons she had tried to teach us both. He never asked about the shares in her trust, and I never offered to discuss them. Some things would be decided in their own time, when I was certain the man my son was becoming would honor the legacy his mother had protected. Lily turned 12 on a crisp October morning, arriving at the cabin with Andrew for a birthday celebration that included fishing, cake, and more laughter than I had heard in years. After the candles were blown out and the presents opened, I took her aside and handed her the sealed envelope Margaret had left the one marked for Lily open on her 18th birthday. "Your grandmother wrote this for you before you were even born," I said, watching her turn the envelope over in her hands with wonder. "She loved you before she ever met you, Lily. She believed in the person you would become. This letter is proof of that love, but I want you to wait until you're 18 to read it. Can you promise me that?" Lily nodded solemnly, clutching the envelope to her chest. "I promise, Grandpa. I'll keep it safe until then." That evening, after Andrew and Lily had driven home, I sat on the porch watching the sun descend toward the mountains. Margaret's photograph rested on the small table beside me, the same image I had carried through every battle of the past year. The light caught her smile, making it seem almost alive, almost present. "I did what you asked, sweetheart," I said softly, speaking to her across the distance that separated the living from the dead. "I protected what mattered. I kept Lily safe. I gave Andrew the chance to become the man you always believed he could be." I paused, feeling the evening breeze carry my words toward the water. And I finally learned something it took me 68 years to understand. Strength isn't about fighting back. It's about knowing what's worth fighting for. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the lake in gold and crimson, colors so beautiful they seemed borrowed from a world more perfect than this one. I watched until the last light faded, until the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, until the peace I had sought for so long finally settled into my bones like warmth returning after a long winter. I closed my eyes and smiled. For the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not happiness, exactly, though happiness was part of it. Something deeper, more permanent. The quiet certainty that I'd lived well, loved well, and built something that would endure. Peace. And so ends the story of Frederick Callahan, a man who learned that the greatest battles are not fought with fists or fury, but with patience, evidence, and the quiet strength to stand firm when everything around you crumbles. He faced betrayal from those who should have loved him most, weathered storms that would have broken weaker men, and emerged not bitter or vengeful, but at peace. Margaret's love guided him from beyond the grave, her wisdom lighting the path when darkness threatened to overwhelm. Lily's courage reminded him that truth, spoken clearly and without fear, remains the most powerful weapon against those who build their lives on lies. And Andrew's transformation proved that redemption is possible for those willing to do the hard work of becoming better. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself or someone you love in Frederick's struggle, please share it with others who need to hear its message. Too many elders suffer in silence, dismissed by families who should protect them, exploited by those who see age as weakness rather than wisdom. But as Frederick learned, we are never truly alone when we have the courage to seek help and the strength to demand respect. Thank you for staying until the end. Your support means everything to us. Please leave a comment telling us what moved you most about Frederick's journey. Did you recognize the warning signs? Have you faced similar challenges in your own family? Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss another story. Until next time, remember, kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Protect what matters, hold steady, and never stop fighting for the people you love.